Hi, and welcome everyone to today's webinar, What is Public Policy and Does Your Nonprofit Need a Strategy? Today's webinar is being co-presented by the Ontario Nonprofit Network and Maytree with our learning partner, Community Foundations of Canada. I'm Estelle Taylor, the Communications Manager at the ONN, and today I'm the behind-the-scenes tech person. A few technical notes just to get us started. Your mics are muted, but if you want to ask questions, please go ahead and use the chat function at the bottom. We are going to be taking questions at the end, but if questions come up for you, feel free to write them out as we go along. The webinar is the second in a 5-part series that features the content from 2 Maytree programs, Maytree Policy School and Civics Exchange. And you can learn more about these programs at www.maytree.com. We're looking forward to today's webinar, and we've got over 100 people joining us today from all over Canada, including Edmonton, Waterloo, Toronto, Vancouver, Mississauga, Calgary, Regina, Guelph, and Dartmouth. People are coming from organizations of a variety of sizes, from small grassroots organizations to large multi-service agencies. And people are also working on a range of issues, including health, the environment, business, social services, education, public sector, law, culture, and recreation. We have a great panel for you today. Kareem Bardisi is the Distinguished Visiting Professor, Special Advisor to the President at Ryerson University, and co-founder of Ryerson Leadership Lab. He's a public service leader who has worked at the intersection of public policy, politics, journalism, and academia for the last 15 years. He's a Distinguished Visiting Professor and Special Advisor to the President at Ryerson in Toronto, where he's launching a new leadership lab. He was previously Deputy Provincial Secretary for the Premier of Ontario and served as Executive Director of Policy for previous premiers. He's worked as a journalist, as an editorial writer at the Globe and Mail, and as an editorial assistant at Slate magazine. And he was a Diversity Fellow with the Greater Toronto Civic Action Alliance. He has taught narrative and leadership at the University of Toronto School of Public Policy and Governance and has a BA from McGill University and an MPP from Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Welcome, Kareem. Julia Drydick is the Managing Director of the Public Interest Strategy and Communications, a social enterprise that helps to build effective and progressive public policy through research, community engagement, and strategy design. For over 10 years, Julia has worked with multiple levels of government and the community services sector to design and implement sustainable policy solutions to complex challenges. She has contributed to advocacy and policy development from both inside and outside of government, with a primary focus on poverty reduction issues. Prior to returning to public interest in 2017, Julia's most recent role was Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of the Ontario Ministry of Community and Social Services, where she provided strategic policy advice towards the transformation of Ontario's social assistance programs and the design and implementation of Ontario's basic income pilot. Welcome, Julia. Okay, well, let's get started. We've got a great hour ahead of us. So over to you, Kareem.
Thanks, Estelle. I think we're going to get started with a poll that folks online are going to respond to now, just to indicate the issues that they are interested in working in, or that they work in their organization. So you all can click on that now. The squirrels and chipmunks are running as fast as they can on their wheel, and the votes are coming in.
Like election day.
Like election day. And here's the results. So we've got a number of plurality, I guess, kind of an election term there, interested in health, education, and then labor market, arts, and the environment are kind of the issue areas that you're interested in. So that's a helpful context for us as we do this presentation, and especially helpful, I think, to have issues that are primarily provincial in focus and jurisdiction. Julia and I both have most of our experiences in provincial public policy issues, and that's where a lot of the action is, as you would know, in terms of public policy and political activity. So I want to start by just trying to lay out at the highest level what public policy is, so that we can get kind of a bit of a flavor of of what is this work. I'm now teaching a number of undergrads who are not policy students in leading change and in working on pressing public challenges. And the term public policy is actually a bit alienating. It implies a degree of specialization that turns some people off. And so one of the things I think we want to do is to give you the tools, whether you're a public policy expert or not, to understand how to further the conversation in your organizations. And I'm going to start with a bit of an overview about what it is, and then Julia is going to get into how it's going to be impactful in your organization. So you've got the slide there. I like to think of public policy as the rules of the game, and that raises a number of other questions. What is the game I'm playing, and whose rules are they? And as it turns out, that public policy is really all around us. It affects the ways we live together. It affects the foods we eat. It affects the kinds of interactions we have through technology, and it affects the day-to-day lives of all the people you touch and all the people you're trying to serve. And so, because it's the rules of the game, the public policy is really all around us. And I want to give you a bit of an example to show this. And you've got some pictures of some people there who are affected by public policy. So these are residents in Parkdale. Parkdale is a neighborhood in the west side of Toronto, historically quite built up, lots of apartments and large old rooming houses or old Victorian houses that turned Edwardian houses that got turned into rooming houses and other places where lots of people live. So it's quite a diverse neighborhood. It's quite a well-populated neighborhood, and there are a good proportion of low-income people living in that neighborhood. And there you see a picture of Roma Rochester on the left and Jennifer Rosser. I'm just going to read to you, and on the right, you've got a picture of Mark Farquharson and the person called in the article his wife. I'm sorry, we don't have her name. These pictures are from a CBC story that ran about a month ago. And I just want to read you a bit of this story to help you understand a bit of what I mean by public policy being all around us and that public policy is the rules of the game. So I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs from the story. A group of tenants in Parkdale say that they recently finished a renovation to the building's lobby. According to its application to the Landlord and Tenant Board, the work cost $296,935. So there you've got some of the players and some of the issues around public policy. The article mentions, incidentally, renovation to the lobby, which cost almost $300,000. Mark Farquharson and his wife are standing in front of one of the fruits of that renovation, which is a painting, which cost around $2,000. So let's just skip. So again, we've got Mark and his wife on the right, and Roma and Jennifer on the left, tenants in this building, and they're thinking about taking action. So let's just skip to the next slide. So the next slide, on the next slide, I think there's a couple of things we have to appreciate about public policy. Is that again, it's the rules of the game, and it involves two things that we sometimes shy away from. And I've got this in really big letters just to show you how important these things are. The first is agenda setting. So the next slide will show really big letters, agenda setting. This is agenda setting is who gets an issue on the table, and who gets to decide that something is a priority. Next kind of big issue around public policy is on the next slide, power. Who has power, who has resources? So now let's get back to our friends in 1251 King Street West. What's going on there? Well, you've got a few things going on there. The landlord has applied for a rate increase on the rents of 3.4%, but the guideline is 1.8%. Well, how is that possible? That sounds illegal. That sounds like you can't do that. And one of the things to appreciate around public policy is it's often around the complexities around the edges. Public policy is often a set of imperfect solutions to problems that are always getting ahead of the solution. And so the background here, and this speaks to the agenda setting and the power relationships involved, is that there was an appreciation at some point in government and some point by people in the sector, in the residential sector, that building managers, property owners needed the ability to refine and improve their housing stock, and that needed to be paid for. So what that allowed was a public policy rule that said, here's your rent increase allowable guideline. But if you do things that improve the building, you can go over the guideline. So once again, the tenants in that picture were expecting a maximum 1.8% increase. The property owner did renovations that required a cost recovery and maybe more beyond that at 3.4%. The tenants are stressed. Toronto is already a very stressed housing market. The tenants are already paying a great proportion of their incomes or whatever resources they have in rent, and they are finding that they can't afford, or they don't want to be party to this higher than above rent guideline increase. Everyone is playing their correct role here. The tenants are saying there's a guideline in place. The landlord is saying, I want to go above that guideline, and I'm allowed to do that for these reasons. The tenants are saying, we have to do something about this. And in both cases, it's almost a demonstration of the different kinds of power at play. The landlord, the property management company, their primary resource, primary power resource is capital, the land capital and the financial capital allows them to make these investments. Now I'm going to read a bit more of the article to get a bit of sense of maybe what some of the power relationships are. And it's important to note in this article that the landlord was not available for quote in this article. It sometimes happens with powerful players who don't want to be brought into the media spotlight. So sometimes you'll get in public policy stories, you'll only hear one side of the story for that reason. So I'm quoting here from Parkdale Community Legal Services, Cole Weber, quoted in the article. This rent increase is part of the landlord's strategy to push tenants out so they can raise the rent without limit. Meanwhile, they neglect the in-unit maintenance for long-standing tenants. Lack of heat and general repair and maintenance issues are ongoing headaches for long-time tenants that often go unanswered, he told CBC Toronto. The only time the landlord appears to put any work into a unit, Farquharson and Weber say, is when a tenant moves out. They put in a brand new kitchen, brand new bathroom. They rip out a wall or two to make it more open concept. It's really nice. It looks like a condo. And so what you have here is what appears to be a bit of a strategy by the landlord and the property management company to increase its financial returns according to the rules that are allowed by public policy. And you have tenants that are looking at their power, in this case, their ability to withhold rent, which has its own legal implications, of course. Under most legislation, a non-paying renter can be evicted at a given moment with a process that leads up to that. But you're seeing tenants coming together using collective action to organize themselves to withhold their rent and hope to force changes. Now, they're probably hoping to force some policy changes as well as a change of decision at the landlord-tenant board. They would want to see a more rational way of doing this policy. Again, what I referred to earlier. The policy says that a certain amount of rent increase is allowed, but a bigger increase is allowed if there are improvements made to the property. Those decisions were made many years ago, and those decisions are always being tweaked. But it turns out that, as I said, public policy is about imperfect solutions to problems that are always getting ahead of the solutions. In this case, what has happened is that the landlord has found another way to increase its financial return, and the tenants are struggling with it. Now, maybe this would be okay, but we're looking at more than just one building here. We're looking at a neighborhood, we're looking at a city and a region that has generally had stress with respect to availability of rental properties, and has seen lots of people facing increasing difficulty with paying their monthly rent or mortgage. So that's some of the context here around this situation. Now, maybe I spoke to the power that each of the players has here, but the tenants have seized a bit of the agenda because they've managed to make a bit of a public fuss. As mentioned in the article, they are following on the tails of a previous rent strike, and things like rent strikes, things where people come together to take action to oppose someone else with more power, can seize some of the public agenda. So I just wanted to tell that story to show you some of the dynamics around public policy. So some of the takeaways from this story and from how public policy works more generally is public policy is the rules of the game, but the rules can be changed, and that applies for all the players in the game. Public policy involves visible players and players who are invisible. So, as an example, the rental management company, the property management company, may be quite different from the landlord. The owner of the building may not even be resident in Canada. Property markets are global, and there are many multinational players in them. And so, the tenant might be withholding their check to the superintendent, but the superintendent is part of a large embedded system of players, many of whom are not immediately visible. Many of the other players here involve the banks. They might involve issues like planning, so planners who set the appropriate sizes for heights for buildings and the appropriate densities in neighborhoods. All these players are impacting this one issue because of the context in which these people live. And again, property market's a very interesting example because it's a largely a private market, but there are all these public policy considerations that have been brought into play. The third element here, the third learning, is that public policy involves judgments where everyone has a legitimate perspective, and maybe judgments that should be guided by our values alone. So again, on the one hand, the power players in this setting, the landlord, property management company on the one hand, and the tenants on the other hand, are both right from one set of perspectives. They're both working legitimately. Neither of them are breaking the law. And yet, on the other hand, you have these values judgments. In this story, we hear mostly the values judgments of the tenants who say, we need a place to live and this isn't fair. And they might have some other critiques around how much money is being made by the property management company and the landlords at their own expense. We haven't heard the values of the landlord and the property management company in this story yet, although we do see the $2,000 painting, perhaps an indication of some of the values there. It wasn't a great painting, so I don't know if it was worth their $2,000. The fourth takeaway from this story is that public policy's main tool is numbers. And you'll be seeing this, and Julia will get more into this, as you start your engagement with a public policy strategy. Public policy is around dollars and cents. It's around wage rates. It's around proportions of things that go to different activities. It's around how much value you get for the spend of money. It's around what's the appropriate level of, as an example in this story, what's the appropriate annual increase for rent. That's a values-laden story, but that's also something that's deeply embedded in the data. It's deeply embedded in all the other activities, all the other financial transactions that guide our lives. So that's the main tool of public policy, and in engaging with public policy people, you will often be dealing with numbers. But words are just as important, and the words are the stories, the values, the narratives, as well as the legal regimes that lead to these interpretations that need to be constantly refined. Once again, the public policy story in this example involves a maximum rent increase of a certain amount and an ability to go above that increase if you make certain renovations. Well, what kinds of renovations should be allowed? What kinds of renovations should be considered appropriate, especially in the situation as discussed in this article, where people said their basic needs weren't being affected. And that's not something you can quantify. That's something that is qualitative and involves descriptions of lives as we see it that are more subjective and more subject to disagreements. So that's an overview of kind of some of the dynamics that are involved in public policy. You don't need to be a public policy expert to engage in any of these aspects, as you see, but you need to start to understand the dynamics, the perspectives, some of the vocabulary that the players who are making public policy are facing. And again, this story shows a bit of that dynamic. And so I just close by saying that you need to be aware of the values, the tools, and the players in public policy and advocacy. But remember that this is all embedded in structures of power and structures of agenda setting. And power and agenda setting are fluid and can be the ability to set an agenda, the ability to claim power can be created even where the resources appear to be limited. With that, I'll throw it to Julia.
Thanks, Kareem. I think we're going to start by jumping into another poll right now. So we're going to be asking, does your organization currently have a public policy strategy? I'll give you a couple minutes. I can think of myself a few years ago where I think my answer probably would have been, I don't know. So we're going to dive into that a little bit more. All right. Consideration is in the lead. Give it a couple more seconds and then we'll jump in. All right, so about half of folks are currently considering a public policy strategy. 28% are in the early stages, and 21% are actually in the middle of it. So they got a plan, they're working on it, they're checking through. So we're going to start off and we're going to talk a little bit what we mean by strategy. So strategy is one of those really kind of big words that has a lot of meanings. So if you Google it, what the internet will tell you is that a strategy is a plan of action or it's a policy that's designed to achieve a major goal. So it involves a whole bunch of activities and steps that you think are going to have certain impacts that will eventually lead to a broader goal. I think when I talk to a lot of folks in the nonprofit sector about what we mean about public policy strategy or an advocacy strategy, people get really overwhelmed. And I think there's a general understanding that a public policy strategy needs to be a fully baked, comprehensive set of tools and actions and key players that will all line up and kind of get to an end point. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, that is really not how it works in most situations. But when I see public policy work really, really well in the nonprofit sector, it's when there's a sense of intentionality behind it. So whether it's a small activity or a big activity, there's kind of three major things that I think really successful public policy strategies ask themselves. And one is, what is it that we're really trying to achieve? So in the example that Kareem said, they specifically wanted to reduce that extra 1.5% of rental increase. The goal, though, wasn't necessarily to create a more fair and affordable housing system for all of Parkdale. When nonprofit agencies are really successful, it's also when there's thought about being really kind of specific, intentional, and precise about what your goals are and how that fits into your organization. So the second kind of big question is, what resources do you have at your disposal to be able to engage in a strategy? What are you already doing? What's your organization already good at? Are you strong at communications? Are you already embedded in existing networks? Do you already have relationships with key governments or politicians? So really kind of mapping out or conducting a bit of an audit around what you already kind of have at your disposal. And then what is it that you're able to do that other folks can't? So really good strategies use resources for the most efficient and effective use. And that means not duplicating resources, tactics, or tools as much as possible. It means filling in on gaps and trying to actually kind of lift all boats through your strategy and your activities. So just generally speaking, there is no prescribed one way to do a strategy. I wish I could give folks a set logic model with a whole bunch of inputs and you could just plug it away and then you'd be told how to, fix a solution or achieve a public policy change. It's just not the way the world works, and it moves way too quickly for that. And also, a robust strategy might not be right for your organization. So depending on your mission and your goals and what it is you're actually trying to achieve, putting all that work into the comprehensiveness of just developing a strategy might not actually be helpful in you achieving what you want to achieve. But at the end of the day, when you ask yourself whether or not you need a strategy, I would say that any tactic you use needs to involve some type of strategic thinking. So the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about whether or not, does your organization need a public policy or an advocacy strategy? And I think the best place to start is actually thinking about your organization. So what's the mission of your organization? Why is it that you're functioning? Why is it you're doing that you're doing? And what is it that you're actually What are the activities you're doing? So who are you serving and why? What's the role and what's the mission? And when you're thinking about a specific public policy issue, what impact does that public policy issue actually have on your ability to achieve that mission? So in Kareem's example, look at Parkdale Legal Services, for example. They do a lot of work advocating for the housing and other rights of low-income individuals in the Parkdale area. The increase to rental housing would have a significant impact on both the types of work they're doing and their ability to do that well. It means that they would have to divert a ton of resources to be able to support folks who are either in conflict with their landlord or not able to afford their housing. And so it has a direct impact on their mission, their vision, and also their day-to-day activities. And also think through who your major stakeholders are as an organization. Stakeholders is one of, again, those fancy government words that politicians love. But think through who it is that's actually involved in your world. Is it constituents in your neighborhood, just people living in the neighborhood? Do you have clients? Are you a frontline service delivery agency? Is it your staff? Maybe it's your funders as well, or maybe it's society at large. Maybe you're seeing a bigger impact. So being really kind of clear about who this is impacting and how. And then also thinking through what can your organization bring to the table that's completely unique, and understanding where they're able to do that. So for example, individuals and the tenants that Kareem talked about, they brought their lived experience. They brought the real reality of the impact this is having on them and the fact that they aren't able to necessarily guarantee that they can afford rent or that they're going to be able to live a decent standard of living if rents increase. Parkdale Community Legal Services was able to probably bring greater advocacy work as well as an understanding of the existing laws and regulations and where those problems may exist. And at the same time, too, you've also got to think about the landlords and their vested interests and how that breaks down. So in terms of key takeaways, the first one is don't try to boil the ocean, right? So one organization can't do everything. You don't necessarily want to start with a strategy where you're going to try and engage in every single possible tactic and role and where you're going to do everything. It's important that individual agencies and players in this situation, and when you're trying to advocate for a public good or a policy change, try and do it with a collective impact approach in mind. Where you don't have to be a hero. And actually, usually where there's one major hero in a major social movement or in an advocacy campaign, it ends up weakening the fabric of the movement overall. So again, go back to your organization's strategic role. Think about the assets and the resources that you have at play. And then think about what gaps exist. So what isn't happening where information isn't being communicated, and how could your agency actually potentially fill that in? When you're thinking about doing that, though, my only other word of caution, especially if you're a service delivery organization, is to think about what impacts this might have on your organization overall. So overstretching yourself, understanding that a lot of nonprofits have pretty fixed resources. Try and think through, if you're going to start allocating a whole bunch of resources to public policy and advocacy, is there a risk that's going to start taking away from other things? And I think one of the concerns that we see too is that in order to be really effective at advocacy, one of the best things that you can have in your back corner is also knowing that you deliver really strong services and that you're responsive and really good at achieving your organizational mission. So now we're going to get into some of the nuts and bolts around what this might actually look like, and we're going to chat through tactics. So I've broken these down a little bit in terms of organizing, communications, and then actually contributing to decision-making and engaging with government and decision makers. So the first one is around organizing. And this isn't always what we always think about when it comes to, bringing people together and holding mass protests. Really, it's about convening people and fully understanding the situation. So as Kareem was mentioning, and I love the way you put it, what was it? That public policy is a solution to a problem that keeps getting ahead of the solution. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really good explanation of what's happening. And it is incredibly complicated. So as a nonprofit agency engaged sometimes in the grassroots or understanding how things are playing out in local areas, you have an incredible amount of knowledge in terms of how things might play out. And one of the things that you can start doing is actually convening people and painting a bigger picture of what some of those unanticipated outcomes might be through a policy change. So understanding that things are really complicated, if you can take the opportunity to start bringing people together and understanding how this is influencing and impacting folks in different ways, to be able to tell that story to government later on. It's also really important as a way to have people understand the impact that this is having in their lives and in their work. So it helps build momentum. It helps create a sense of engagement and agency within a movement, but it also helps really clearly define the problem that you're looking at and what a good solution might actually look like. I also want to say that generally speaking, again, precision here is important. And often when people try to organize around really big, really kind of over-aspirational or idealistic issues, it can really make it harder to kind of build momentum over time. So the more kind of clear and concrete the problem definition and the policy issue is, the easier it is to be able to set things up so that you can actually see some early wins. But when the goal is so big and when any type of success is really far away, then it can actually really take away from the momentum of the movement. The second is around communication. So how do you then go and make your issue heard? And there's a whole bunch of stuff out there that people are used to doing. So social media, engaging the mainstream media, you can pitch an editorial board, you can write an op-ed. You can also do the really kind of traditional old school stuff. You can organize a protest, you can send around a petition, you can hold a lobby day, and you can campaign. But throughout that, I think one thing that I see missing sometimes in the nonprofit sector is ongoing documentation of what you know. And this goes to Kareem's point around numbers. So there's a whole bunch of work that your organization probably does that feels qualitative. You're hearing stories from your clients, you're talking to funders or other stakeholders about other issues, and there's not a lot of always consistent documentation of what that looks like and the impact it's having. So even if it feels like a qualitative or a narrative story, actually engaging in the process of writing it down, documenting it, and being able to demonstrate the impact later on is really, really important.
Can I say something?
Yes.
So governments in particular are often better at getting aggregate data than they are at getting localized data. And so, an example in Parkdale, one of the things that I remember the advocacy was especially effective at was, where the advocacy was especially effective was to pool that information around the actual rent impacts in those neighborhoods, block by block, building by building, and to tell the story of what was happening there, because that was information that wouldn't have been as clear to the government decision maker sitting at 777 Bay Street, which is where the Provincial Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing is.
Yeah, and where you can go if you care about the tenant issue. No, I'm joking. And to that point too, it's also about exactly that, contributing what you know. And I think, we talk a lot about the importance of evidence-based decision-making in data and government, but when you're coming and thinking about building your evidence base, I think it's important to know that you don't need a randomized control trial or a statistically significant sample or peer-reviewed literature to be able to demonstrate evidence to government, right? So exactly what you were saying. You're able to collect the information about what the impact would be locally, and that can either be through local members, but also finding a way to kind of demonstrate with some real kind of capacity the trends that you're seeing over time. It's really, really helpful. You also don't necessarily need to have, fully resourced research and public policy department to be able to do this work either. And I think it's really good to look at what tools you already have at your disposal. So, for example, Daily Bread Food Bank is a really good example of this in terms of their final report. Every year, their annual report is also a snapshot of some of the key demographics and other trends that they're seeing within the people that they serve. And so they're able to use those tools that are already part of their organization to be able to extend their public policy message. That might not work for all organizations and for all boards, but I just want to say that you don't necessarily need to come out with your own independent, showy report or campaign or strategy to be able to start embedding this into the work of your organization. The other thing that I want to talk about really quickly before we move on to questions and discussion is about relationship building. So I think it's really important to be broad in terms of the relationships that you want to build and the way that you start communicating your issues and the data that you're bringing to the table, both with politicians but also with government staff. So there's, again, a whole bunch of tactics that you can use. You can go and you can meet with elected officials, you can submit letters, but also embedding yourself within the bureaucracy as much as possible and actually participating in processes where the government asks for your feedback. So if there are consultations, if they want to hear what you have to say and how you want to contribute to an issue, that really does matter. It actually has a really big impact, and it is taken seriously in terms of public policy making. Again, you might not always have the resources for this. And a submission on a major public policy issue can take a whole bunch of resources from your organization, or it could be relatively contained. But then again, always think back to how is this contributing to our mission? How is this making us a better organization? And how is this deepening the impact that we're having in terms of what we're trying to achieve?
Julia, how do you know what the right answer is? So you've got all these information collected, you've got all these problems that you're diagnosing. How do you know what the solution is?
I don't know if there's ever been a perfectly right solution to this stuff. And I think one of the things that we've struggled with, and I think we see a lot of people empowered struggling with, is the idea of having a policy solution with zero losers, right? So we struggle a lot with, how do you create a situation where you're fundamentally fixing a problem without any losers involved? So in the rent strike situation, and
the original policy was intended to create no losers.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden it has this unintended impact on tenants. At the same time, if you were going to change the strategy completely or the policy, then all of a sudden landlords start losing. And so that's where the value judgment comes in. That's where decision making is really, really hard. So in a perfect policy world, I think good public policy tries to mitigate that as much as possible and tries to, come up with a solution that evens the playing field, ideally considers things like fairness and equity and the type of society we want to live in. But like you were saying, it kind of depends on your values and where you're coming from.
I'd also add, for those who want to start to nerd out, we have some resources at the end to do that. But one really important thing to note about public policy and kind of the world of the possible solutions is that it itself is not determined and fixed. So you were working on the universal basic income pilot for the province, or the basic income pilot. The idea of a basic income experiment of any kind was something that was relegated to the annals of deeply left-wing journals for many years. And now you have a number of people across the political spectrum speculating that part of that, that there might be answers to some of our challenges through something like a basic income. And there's some now information being collected on that in Ontario and elsewhere. So I think it's important in this work to not necessarily always, to be aware that it's possible to push against the bounds of of what is currently accepted. Not always a good tactical move, but it's something that can be discussed within your organization to say, what's the thing what's the thing that we're not going to get, but we want to get on the agenda, and then to know in a more serious way what's the actual outcome you're trying to achieve, being a step back from that.
Yeah, and that was a great example too of local community agencies coming together and really stepping to the table in terms of helping to inform how that pilot should get rolled out. So again, great idea, right? We want to end poverty. Let's bring everyone up to, above the poverty line. This is fantastic. Actually very complicated. And if you look at the entire system of social support that are available to people, and the fact that we wanted to implement a policy where there were no losers, where everyone was better off, there were some community agencies that really stepped up and came to the table and shared information in terms of how things would work and how things wouldn't work, and helped government actually foresee what some of the potential unintended consequences might be.
Now, there's been two, I used to participate in lots of government decision-making, and there were two things that would basically be said at every government decision-making table that I was at, from a government perspective. One was, we need to communicate better, and the second was, all these things are not aligned, we need to coordinate better. So in government, and this is something that probably these are perhaps complaints that the people participating in this web seminar or webinar have today, communication and coordination are two of the biggest challenges that that people see coming from government, that they're not seeing government communicate well enough, and they're not seeing government coordinate their programs well enough. Any kind of comments on that? Are we just cursed to live in a universe where communication and coordination will always be a challenge?
I think it's always going to be a work in progress. I don't think that there's ever kind of final solution, and I think it's something that you see across the nonprofit and community services sector as well. I think part of it is because it's more of an art than a science, but it also requires really intentional resourcing. And again, if this is work that your agency or your organization wants to take on, actually finding the resources to staff this adequately, so you've got someone who's reaching out to all of the different stakeholders, setting up meetings, taking notes, synthesizing it, communicating it out. All of this work can be really hard when it's just happening off the side of someone's desk.
governments much more prefer to work with coalitions, and coalitions can often be more effective anyway. So.
Yeah, and I think it's also a learning curve within government. And I would also say it doesn't get as much credit, but I think the private sector also probably struggles with this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Do we have some questions from the audience yet, or do you want to ask me anything? What you all don't know is that we have a background in both government and in academia, so we're trying to hold back. Well, you might get a couple of our stories in a second, but
yeah. Just trying to kind of put some more kind of clarity maybe from the government perspective on agenda setting. So where you've been, what are some of the kind of influencing factors that can set the agenda from the outside?
So the government has its own pretty strong agenda setting tools through its kind of major things that it does, especially budgets, throne speeches, and election platforms, and mandate letters. So those are 4 incredibly powerful tools where the government or the party that aspires to govern can really set out what it thinks matters in a fairly deep and substantial way, and include very specific policy solutions under those. So to influence that, there's a couple of ways that come to mind. One is through political parties. I think political parties, including involvement in riding associations, is sometimes an underrated, an underappreciated place to start to advocate. Obviously, elected officials and their staff and public servants are going to be advocated, but they can be getting involved in a political party can be a way to advance an agenda. Relationships with sympathetic reporters, very important, especially those in those metro areas where you might only have 1 or 2 people on that beat, whether it's a housing beat, a social justice beat, an education beat. Being in touch with, cultivating, giving those reporters information and stories that they're not getting can really help advance an agenda. I think it's also important to work with the world of thought leadership, whether it's academic think tank institutions or individual researchers who are doing interesting work are often looking for audiences or looking for places where they can do their research. I'd also add, I think, once it's mature enough, some of the private sector, some of the philanthropic and foundation-led activity that's more private sector driven can be an effective place. So, as an example, Royal Bank of Canada just retooled its entire philanthropic strategy around school to work transitions by young people. It's a five-year, $500 million strategy. You might see some signs up and around. And they turned away, frankly, or it looks like they're going to turn a little bit away from some of their other work in water and in the arts and a few other places. So being able to influence at the corporate level can really help drive a narrative and an agenda.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe this is naive too, but I also think people sometimes have misguided perceptions of politicians as well. And I think from my experience in government, one thing that really struck me was that overall, I think a lot of politicians, the majority that I've ever worked with, are there because they actually want to do good, right? Like they actually want to serve their communities and they want to make the city, the province, the country a better place. And I think being able to engage with the political system in a way that helps them further that and understand how they can do a better job of that can be really effective.
Yeah, and we haven't talked yet, we didn't really talk about, as a tactical point, how sharp to be in sort of partisan policy debates. And you know, charities have a decision to make around that with respect to their charitable status. But it's a really important point to, in general, it is advisable to at least have in the front of your mind the policy objective and the constituency that you're trying to advocate for, and less about scoring points for or against one party. At least at the stages that we've talked about here, for sure.
It's Estelle. I'm going to jump in here again because we've had quite a few questions from the audience, and we won't have time to answer too many. I'm going to start with one, and the questioner sort of, was good. She asked kind of 3 questions in one, so this is a big question for you. But she asks, when developing a strategy, can you give us some suggestions around timeline, around the number of initiatives to keep it feasible, and some suggestions on how to evaluate the success of that strategy? It's a real practical nuts and bolts question.
Right. So Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through this a lot, but in terms of timelines, it depends, I think, where you're at in terms of the budgetary and decision-making cycle based on whichever jurisdiction that you're looking at. So I would encourage agencies to think a little bit more about developing longer-term strategies, but not necessarily where you expect that you're going to get everything by a specific period of time. So, for example, the province specifically has a very kind of set annual process where it defines and makes decisions around the budget and around priorities. The budget is usually released late winter, early spring. So if you're going in January with your budget act, chances are you're already out of time. It's already, pretty much written up and it's good to go. What you want to do is then get ahead about 8 months in advance to try and start building relationships and trying to figure out how to advance your policy agenda for the next year. A
real shortcut on that, pre-work in the spring, activity over the summer and early fall, and by mid-fall, at least on a provincial budget timeline, get the ask in by November. Yeah. If you're asking for money or policy changes sometimes. If it's a policy change that doesn't involve money, then there's different timelines that can be affected sometimes by other processes. Yeah. But for budgets, that's a generally good rule of thumb.
Yeah, and the number of initiatives really depends on the size of your organization and the resources that you have. I think it's really important not to overwhelm yourselves too much. I think doing too much at the same time can be really confusing, both to the general public, but also to decision makers. So if you've got a whole bunch of tactics happening at the same time, it's hard to actually clearly communicate that. But you can be working on different things at different times, like Kareem said. So initially post-budget, what you might want to do is actually reach out to some decision makers to start building a relationship and to comment on some decisions. Then you would be doing some of the groundwork over the spring and summer and building up your research base or bringing a coalition together, and then again, hit them with an ask in the fall.
I would also add, it can be detrimental to be too prescriptive in your solution because governments have legions of analysts who are looking at every side of your thing, and what you might think is a very sensible solution might have raise all kinds of flags for government. Doesn't mean you don't engage on what you think is your correct solution, but policymakers and other stakeholders need a certain amount of wiggle room. So if you're too wedded to your solution, then that sometimes limits your effectiveness.
And in terms of evaluating success really quickly, it really depends on what you're doing. So when you're talking about your tactics, when you're picking what you want to do, keep asking yourself why, right? So we want to do a rent strike. Why? What impact do you think that's going to have? Do you think it's going to scare landlords? Do you think it's going to bring media attention? Do you think it's going to, bring politicians to the table? There's no set answer there. And I would also avoid setting concrete numbers necessarily, but just general targets. So did it achieve some type of media pickup? Was there response from a local politician? Have people started talking about it in different ways? Are you convening groups where there's more people participating? It really depends on where you're at and the scope of the issue. But again, I think it's important too to be iterative and to use those benchmarks as tools for learning. So you might have assumptions about what one activity might give you. You might get something totally different. That's okay. Incorporate it into your strategy and move forward.
I have a question here about geography, which I know is going to impact many of the organizations listening today. The question is, for those organizations that aren't in the provincial capital, is that a real barrier for them for influencing the agenda setting? And if it is, I suppose, what can be done about that?
Yeah, so I can speak to this. So sometimes organizations outside a provincial capital, and Queen's Park is maybe a bit unusual because there are large cities, also the capital cities, not true in all provinces. Sometimes it takes a bit of an outsized personality from the sector, from the organization who's outside the provincial capital to really make an impact. So I remember in the universities sector, there was a couple of university presidents in particular who were very present at Queen's Park, even though they were even though their universities were outside Toronto. Sometimes you'll also, if you think you're doing something, if some of your work is especially noteworthy and has been recognized as such, you can sometimes cut through a bit of that. So an example I remember is there are a number of workforce planning boards in Ontario which do this work of aligning labor market supply and demand, and work with both employers and employment agencies to determine how to set up training programs and how to plan. And there was one workforce planning board in particular in the Waterloo region, which was always known to be very effective. And so we would always have sort of special regard for that group. So if you have some proven track record, that can sometimes help as well. And then the other thing I would point out is you have to be even more active on the political side there, because you do have access to your political decision maker, but you don't necessarily have access to the public servant decision maker. The public servant decision maker is probably in Queen's Park, but you will have an MPP, and you will have an MPPs. For those who don't know, when a legislature is in session or a federal parliament is in session, they meet weekly, and MPPs are in their own caucuses, in their own party caucuses, and MPPs are often bringing messages from their constituencies into those caucus meetings, and often championing the perspectives from very specific organizations, and they have a chance there to then influence their caucus and cabinet colleagues.
I have another question here. It might not have an easy answer. Are there best practices? Is there a best practices approach to efficiently interconnecting multiple provincial ministries to give attention to the same issue?
Well, government struggles with this itself. There are many, if we went down to Queen's Park and asked for the list of interministerial committees, no such list would exist, but everyone would be on one. Anyone you talk to would be on one, or would be on at least one interministerial committee of various levels of seniority, dealing with all kinds of issues, whether it's operational policy, farther out into the future policy, stakeholder relations, committees that are officially set up. One tactic is actually that can be useful is to ask for a committee to be officially set up, or to get set through legislation or regulation, the requirement for groups, committees to come together of different public servants. One example where this worked not badly on a controversial issue is the siting of wind turbines in Southern Ontario, which involved ministries everywhere from energy, obviously energy and environment, to ministries you wouldn't expect, like tourism, culture, and sport. Why is tourism, culture, and sport involved in the siting of wind turbines? Because tourism, culture, and sport houses the archaeology department of the province, and you need to do archaeological work to make sure you can site a wind turbine appropriately. So sometimes in the governments are pretty good at setting up committees. They're not always good at following through on them, especially if there's a real policy intent. They're better on operational matters, but on policy it can be really tough.
Yeah. And from a nonprofit perspective too, so like Khanna was saying, there is no really best practice, and I think it's still a learning process to the government perspective. But if you look at the actual definition of best practice, which is a formally evaluated, practice, there's more emerging through collective impact work across the nonprofit sector, and actually specifically the Trillium Foundation is now funding collective impact work, and part of that is being measured and evaluated. So I think it's still kind of early days. But some of the principles that are outlined in that way of kind of cross-organizational collaboration and coordination is around really trying to understand what the shared common agenda is, and not being too prescriptive for all of those individual players about how they go about contributing to that. But I think actually getting to that point where people agree on what the problem is and what the goal is can be the biggest piece of work.
There's one more quick piece of this. Governments think in terms of programs, and they're organized in terms of programs. They're not organized in terms of people. There's no Ministry of Parkdale. There's a Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, or a Ministry of Housing that deals with some of the issues of the people in Parkdale. So one thing that can be helpful for the sector to do is to remind governments that it's not just about the programs, it's about how the programs touch the people, and to really illustrate, using some of the tactics Julia mentioned, how different ministries touch people. Because again, government officials may not always be aware of the full extent of that. Thanks so much for joining us today. We have some learnings that we've kind of put up on the page here. Here's my, again, takeaways in terms of public policy broadly, as being the rules of the game. It's all around us. You have to sniff and sneak around to figure out exactly what's going on, to determine who's involved, to be aware, for instance, that there's political decision makers and public servants, often both involved, that there are different levels of government involved, and it's not always clear what that level of government is until, again, you sniff around and see what policies are actually involved. That involves values, tools, and players that are clear to you, but sometimes hidden, and that you need to use both words and numbers and be aware of agenda setting and power dynamics to further your agenda.
And then I guess my key takeaways are there's no fine science to this, so there's no one way to go about building a strategy. And again, going about a huge, robust strategy that's overly prescriptive might not be right for your organization. It might not actually be the most effective way to go about it. But any and all public policy, advocacy, or work needs to involve strategic thinking. Secondarily, don't boil the ocean. Don't try and take on more than what your organization can actually reasonably resource. And think through specifically what your unique value add is and how this will contribute to the work that you're already doing. And now we've got some resources.
Yeah, so if you want to work in public policy, there's the Policy Job in Toronto, the Policy Jobs TO listserv. If you're interested in learning more about public policy, list of programs there. And some other, the Apolitical website and the Marginal Revolution website are really little things just to get you a taste of what this world is from the perspective of the practitioners. And I think it's just really important if you're interested in this work. It can be intellectually interesting. B, you can get a taste of the actual impacts of those big concepts on the people that you're serving. And so engaging from the side of the big concepts, I think, can be a valuable exercise. And there's some really interesting content in those blogs.
Yeah, I've also included a couple resources of advocacy organizations that are doing a lot of the work and mapping out what a lot of the issues are at the federal, provincial, and municipal level. So that's Social Planning Toronto City Budget Watch, which provides pretty comprehensive analysis of what's actually playing down at City Hall, Toronto City Hall, around the budget development, as well as the Income Security Advocacy Center's resources page, which has a lot of information there. And I also included the most recent 2018 Toronto Vital Signs report, because I think that's also a good example of how a whole bunch of different issues can kind of come together and tell a story around impact that can affect a whole bunch of people. And you can also really see the impact of individual narrative come through in that report. All right, thanks everyone.
Yeah, it's Estelle again from the ONN. I want to thank Kareem and Julia so much for the really interesting discussion and so many great tips there over the last hour. So thanks very much. I want to thank Maytree, of course, for helping to co-present the event. And I want to thank the Community Foundations of Canada as our learning partner on this series. I realized there were many, many questions asked. We did not have time for them all. The good news is the election campaign is just gearing up. So we've got months to continue this discussion, including through the upcoming webinars in this Driving Public Policy webinar series, which you will learn a little bit more about in the email that's going to get sent to you in a few hours. So people who haven't had an opportunity to download the handout slide there, we'll be sending that in the email and send you the recording of this webinar. And you can ask us questions there, get in touch with us, and keep the conversation going. Thanks very much for listening. When we shut down the webinar, there is going to be a quick survey, a feedback survey, and we ask you to just take a couple of minutes to answer that. It'll really help us to improve the following webinars. Thanks again. Thanks, Kareem and Julia.
Thank you. Thank you all for participating.